Hey, it's Connor. So, for today's vlog, I'm going to talk about generational differences. So, my parents were boomers. They were late boomers. They came into being in the 19 as adults in the 1970s and the 1980s, which were the 80s were great times economically. There were high rollers going on in the 80s. You're making a lot of money. Economic conditions were favorable. The 70s, if you came into adulthood in the 1970s with the stagflation and the recession that kind of took place in the early 1970s, there's a little bit more struggle that those people had, and it kind of created this sort of dependable kind of like this sense of, oh, well, make yourself indispensable to a company, and if you work really hard, you'll move into upper management, and you'll get promoted within the structure of the organization, and eventually you might be your own boss at some point. And boomers were the last generation to have the defined benefit retirement plans and stuff, where pensions and stuff continued to exist within the private sector into the 1970s and the 1980s. They started going downhill in the 1980s, and eventually it became a thing with corporate raiders in the 1980s, where activist investors and activist shareholders would try to take over control of a company in order to try to have access to the pension plan that they developed. So there's a lot of corporate raiders in the 1980s who were ruthless investors trying to take over companies so that they could have access to the pension funds and liquidate the funds that were in there and just simply give a minor payout to remaining employees or employees that were still getting to have that would have had access to pensions. They would have gotten just a big cash payment in the event that the thing was liquidated. And sometimes you didn't. Sometimes you didn't get anything. The pension fund was just simply liquidated and sold for the pieces to other investors, so that way the corporate raiders could get a big payday from taking over a company that had a pension fund that wasn't even counted as part of the enterprise value of those companies. So the 1980s saw the start of the 401k. A lot of boomers and a lot of Gen Xers came into being, where the norm for retirement savings was your 401k. You would contribute some money, your employer would contribute some money, and it would grow tax-free in an investment account until you reached retirement age. And that became the norm, and that's been the norm for every generation since then, except for some millennials and some Gen Zers. So, well, Gen X got the experience of getting the same experience that boomers got, where they could start at the bottom and work up within the corporate ladder into higher leadership positions and better pay. It's just that they had, in the middle of probably their in the middle of their 20s and 30s, they had the dot-com bubble. Now, it was good opportunity for people that got involved in tech startups and other companies, because they got founder shares and they got stock options that gave them a pretty penny for getting involved inside of tech companies in the dot-com bubble. But then the bubble burst. And when the bubble burst was when the oldest millennials started becoming adults and started working on their own. Now, they either went to college and were still in college through the dot-com bubble, or they became adults and came into existing in the dot-com bubble when the markets were down. A lot of companies were getting very defensive because they got a little bit too wild. They got crunk on the dot-com bubble with the wild payouts and the wild stock valuations and everything else like that. And so employers were a little bit more defensive about their investment strategies and about their hiring practices. So the oldest millennials got to experience that at around the turn of the millennium. And the older millennials got to have the experience of becoming adults during or in the aftermath of the Great Recession, which was when places stopped hiring. If you're going to be hired as a candidate for a management position, they wanted to see if you had previous experience in management. You couldn't just get trained up into the position within a company. So there was a lot of Gen X job hoppers at that time, moving from management from one company that might have been failing or whatever to the management of another company. Millennials didn't get to train up into management positions for a while until baby boomers and Gen Xers started retiring early or seeking opportunity elsewhere or changing their. With Gen X, a lot of them have changed their industry midway through their life. I like to call it the midlife job crisis that Gen X got to experience. They got to experience working up within the corporate ladder of a company, getting into a management position, and then in their 40s or 50s deciding to change industries entirely. Maybe they had enough money saved up that they decided to start their own business, and they started a, like, for example, my neighbor went from having an office job that paid relatively well, and he had a comfortable middle class life, and he decided to quit his job randomly in his 50s and decide to start a taco truck. So I mean, they had something burning inside them that they had an itch they had to scratch. So they had to change their industry, or they had to become business owners and become their own bosses. In the During the pandemic, typically during the recession, a lot of companies that folded, a lot of companies that went out of business, like Circuit City and like other retail jobs that used to be a path that people had to working into a higher income, or it used to be a path to a living wage that people had access to. Those opportunities eventually went away. So when boomers started out, which, let's go ahead and give the year 1975. 1975, minimum wage adjusted for inflation. So at the beginning of their working careers, boomers got to have access to $2.10 per hour, adjusted for historical inflation, depending on the specific consumer price index used. That's roughly equivalent to $11 to $13 an hour. That was the bottom floor of the wages that you could earn. That was the bottom floor. That was the least amount of money that you could get paid. Now, for millennials, we got to experience $5 an hour and $7.25 an hour. That was our bottom wage. And with that being the bottom floor of the wages that we could earn, that suppressed the potential earnings that we could have had with jobs. So when jobs were offering, oh, it's a harder job, but we're going to be offering higher pay, they're basing that higher pay off of a comparatively worthless minimum wage that people had access to, that suppressed the rest of the wages going upwards, that millennials could have access to, and that Gen Xers, some Gen X could have access to. I believe in 1995 the minimum wage was something like $4 an hour, but it's worth about 9 to 9.30 today. So still, that was a higher bottom floor for wages that people had access to. A lot of people got to have the experience of Gen X still got to have the experience of working their way up and training up into upper management positions or middle management positions in the companies that they worked for. They had a lot of economic security that I don't know. I don't know if Gen X is properly addressed enough with the conditions that they got to have. They got to have a major tech bubble in the middle of their adulthood, in the beginning of their investing career, that if they liquidated it, or if they sold their stocks and made a profit off of it, they had higher access to really really high stock gains very early on. Whereas millennials, our investment portfolios had to lag behind with having to deal with the aftermath of the dot-com bubble bursting and the Great Recession. Now, the other thing is that millennials had to become property owners a little bit later. The subprime mortgage crisis mostly impacted boomers and Gen X, and it mostly benefited boomers and Gen X. They had access. They had the easier access to easier financing for being able to purchase a house. Even though it was subprime mortgage loans and stuff, they had better access to capital for financing the purchase of a house or refinancing their home for a while, until it all fell apart, obviously. But millennials, by the time that they were an age that they were making a wage, that they could purchase homes or look at purchasing homes, they didn't have access to the same deregulated funding that Gen X and boomers got to have access to. Now, of course, the 80s and the 90s had multiple different crises and sort of negative economic events. My dad, when he was about 29 years old, got margin called for, I think he said, the equivalent of 2 years of his wages uh, in stocks that he had purchased on margin in 1987 because of a computer error that triggered Black Monday, which was a major short-term crash. But he got margin called on half of the investments that he had, and he didn't make that much money back then. He was like I believe he was either a lieutenant or a captain in the army at the time. Which, if we look at the historical wages, I think it was something close to $2,000 or $2,500 a month, roughly, in wages. And yeah, so wages might have been comparatively lower compared to nowadays. I definitely make a lot more money now uh, than my dad made at my age. But adjusted for inflation, my wages now are worth about the same as what my dad's wages were worth at the same age. So let's see, 1958 plus 32. 1958 plus 32 would have been 1990. So my dad had a stable government job in 1990, working for the army, being in the army and all. He didn't have to worry about living expenses necessarily because all of those were provided for by the army, whether it was BAH, basic allowance for housing. Uh, he Officers don't get the food stipend, so they have to pay for their food and dining facilities on military installations, and they have to pay for all their own food. But if they're out in the field, they get rations provided to them and stuff. But and healthcare was free. If you're in the military, you have free healthcare for yourself and for your family members. Now, my dad also had access to TSP, which is the military's version of 401k programs. TSP is basically a number of funds that are administered by BlackRock. Some of them, and there's different investment styles that each of the funds do, and basically you pick what a specific fund, and you contribute a certain amount of wages, and the army matches you up to a certain level. Now, I got to experience TSP when I was in the army, and TSP is, I think, a good investment program for retirement and savings. But my dad eventually hit 23 years in the military, and because of that, when he retired, he got a retirement check. He got his final wages that he earned in the military. He got to have that payment every month for the rest of his life from retirement funds, and he decided to retire early for a little bit, where he was just staying at home and stuff, and he eventually got a job as a teacher, and he got into teaching. He got into education. My mom had a rockier employment history where she spent a lot of time in college doing coursework. She's one of the most educated people in our house. Both my parents have master's degrees, so they eventually went back and got them. But both of my parents ended up becoming teachers. My mom worked in a hospital for a while, and she decided to quit that once she realized that my dad was getting summer vacation and winter break off at the same time that me and my brother were. So she decided to get a job. It didn't pay that well as a school nurse for an elementary school, but she decided to get that so that way she had the same breaks that the rest of her family had. And that was kind of the living situation that I had, that my parents had growing up. So my dad had a retirement check from the military, and then two teachers' wages equivalent, or two teaching wages in South Texas. So, and then they worked those jobs for a while, and they got access to the teacher's pension plan for the state of Texas. So when they hit retirement, they're getting pensions from being teachers, and my dad's getting his retirement check from the army. And so they're to use this expression that my family's used before, they're shitting in tall cotton. They're in a good situation economically. Now that they're retired, they still have money coming in from pension plans and stuff. And my dad I don't know if my parents are collecting Social Security yet. I think they're delaying it to 70 to get a higher payout. But like that's the situation. Gen X got to have more experience. They were the first generation to really use online brokerages pretty extensively for investing, and they came into an economic situation where it's if you want to retire, you have to invest money and you have to get involved in investments. Millennials don't have the same pension plans. They don't have the severance packages that Gen X and Boomers got to have. That if the company went under, or if they got fired from their job, they got a large chunk of money that they could use to set themselves up with until they could find new employment elsewhere. They didn't have that same sort of economic security that Gen X and Boomers got to have. So, and Gen Z, I don't think has any economic security at all because they came into being. Millennials and Gen Z were the first generation to really get involved in the gig economy because the internet enabled phone apps and smartphones enabled phone apps for people to basically be independent contractors to either deliver food to people on their own schedule in their free time or give people rides and basically be a taxi service for other people. They did The gig economy arose out of a need for more money when the full-time job or your full-time employment wasn't providing enough. It was providing very low wages, very low starting wages compared to the actual cost of living in the country at the time. So, in order to make up for that gap, you had to work gigs and you had to do stuff like rover and walk people's dogs or mow yards or do random little side gigs or side hustles in order to try to make up the gap in your wages because employers weren't paying you comparatively an equivalent wage to what they were paying previous generations. So millennials had some hard economic conditions that they had to come into, but they're getting over it and they've gotten through it. And they've definitely, I think millennials are on course to do good things and be shitting in tall cotton, basically. I think they're going to be in a good situation. I think they're in a good situation currently. I mean, I feel like I'm in a good situation economically. I feel like the job market's pretty good. Uh, at least, at least that's my feelings. And now that's potentially being threatened by AI. Now, AI is not replacing every job, but AI is definitely going to replace a lot of middle management in a lot of companies, especially in tech companies and in the tech industry. It's going to be doing a lot more work that previously was done by humans, and it's going to dry up the jobs available in tech, and it's going to dry up some jobs available inside of doing office work and other things like that. It really only leaves blue collar jobs and sales jobs as viable options for not being replaced by computers, basically for millennials and for Gen Z. So Gen Z is going to miss out on a lot of opportunities with what they could start out into or get jobs in within the tech industry and with like remote work and other things like that. And millennials are kind of in a situation where they know enough that they could probably switch industries to something that pays pretty close to what they're currently getting paid in the event that their job gets made redundant by AI. And I honestly have no sympathy for people in the tech industry. And that sounds kind of mean, but I don't I don't have sympathy for jobs that for kind of bullshit jobs that can be done from home or can be done if you have a job where you're expected to work 8 hours and you can get the work for the day done in 1 hour. I would hardly count that as employment. The rest of the time, if you're having to work in an office, it's basically just babysitting for adults. You're socializing with your coworkers, you're Googling random stuff, or you're watching YouTube videos, or you're not spending the time being productive. Now, sales presents an interesting situation where your payment is directly tied to the amount of productivity and production that you can have or that you make for yourself within a sales job. So that's not going to go away. And plus, there's a lot of things that like AI can definitely not replace salesmen yet. It can replace a lot of the service side of sales. It can replace a lot of the customer interactions with customer service and stuff. But it's not going to necessarily impact the sales side of a business of any business that's selling any product, whatever it happens to be. And then but like office jobs, HR is definitely something that's under threat because it's just going to be replaced by AI. There's going A lot of HR positions are going to be made redundant, and they're just not going to hire for them anymore. I feel like they're going to switch over customer service and employee relations as much as possible to an AI system. So those jobs are under threat, and I feel like uh, teachers' jobs aren't going to be threatened by AI. A lot of school administration is going to get streamlined by AI systems, I believe. But so school administration jobs aren't going to necessarily exist as much as they currently do. And there's going to be a big reeling back in the bureaucracies within corporate work environments and within public public employment, whether it's with schools or state governments or local governments or government programs or government agencies. A lot of jobs are going to eventually be made redundant and are going to be automated by AI in those fields, which I also don't really have sympathy for bureaucrats. I get that they do something for a living, but they often do their jobs with such a formality and just being pedantic about forms and other things like that, that they've actually created a living hell for every other person living in the country. I don't think anyone has ever had a pleasant experience at a DMV, especially when they tell you that you didn't bring all the forms that you needed to bring in order to get driving documentation and stuff. Uh, and then various government jobs like social workers. I feel like social work is going to be impacted by AI. So there's a lot of opportunities that are going to start drying up really quickly in a lot of industries because of the advent of AI. And I think it's going to force a lot of boomers and Gen Xers into early retirement, or they're just going to be laid off when they can't find work elsewhere. It's going to lead to an increase in jobs in the service industry and in retail. It's going to lead to sales jobs increasing, and it's going to lead to a lot of people either becoming self-employed to be able to provide a wage for themselves on their own, or it's going to lead to a more a more formalized freelance or gig economy, that a lot of people are going to turn to the gig economy or freelancing because a lot of that stuff can't be automated. You can't automate a lot of blue collar jobs like construction or a lot of warehouses. Despite the best efforts to try to automate warehouses, you still need a human being looking over inventory and moving things and doing a lot of the work within warehouses, because machines are frankly a liability. They're in their infancy, and I don't think that they could properly replace human beings in a lot of warehouse jobs and in a lot of blue collar jobs as well, because there's a lot of stuff that has to go into a human being making split second decisions that a machine might not be able to do, or might not have the processing time in order to make the split second decisions. And it would just be more efficient to have a human being doing a lot of those jobs. So, yeah, Gen Z, I think, is very similar to millennials in terms of media consumption habits. Millennials were the last generation to remember what it was like before 24/7 media access. You couldn't really stream things on the internet that well. I mean, there's programs where you could stream like a 3-minute video, and it took 10 minutes to load up, so that you could load up a QuickTime video and watch a video on the internet. But you didn't have access to the streaming services that Gen Z grew up with and took advantage of as they grew up with. They've been used to having 24/7 access to media, and it's eventually boiled into an appetite for short form videos and for things like YouTube and also for streaming services and stuff. Millennials still remember when television stations had sign offs, where some TV stations would simply they'd play they'd play like they play like a patriotic song and show an American flag, and then they'd sign off for the evening, and you would just see color bars or a blue screen for 8 hours until the broadcast day resumed the next day. So we were the last generation to experience that. Uh, and then, but with our media habits and our media consumption, we had access to search engines. So we weren't trapped in a particular line of thinking of a particular media company or a particular media producer. We didn't really necessarily, I'm not going to say fall for the propaganda, but we didn't fall for the talking heads and stuff on like cable news networks and stuff like that. We didn't adapt to that. In fact, we kind of view it as being cringe with boomers and Gen Xers watching Fox News or watching MSNBC, and it's just them trying to have confirmation bias with their own beliefs. They just seek out a cable news network to have someone tell them exactly what they think already, to reinforce it and make them go, yeah, I knew I was right about something. Millennials' media habits were defined by consuming media and then doing a quick little Google search and getting a more nuanced perspective on things. So, like, while I would be considered a little bit more socially conservative, I watch stuff from across the political spectrum because I'm fascinated with different takes on things, because obviously the system that we have now isn't fully working. So we need to find alternatives. And I want to hear out every side to this situation, what the alternatives might be. But yeah, our media consumption habits are a little bit different. Gen Z's falling into having influencers kind of tell you what your opinions are going to be on things. So they kind of are falling back into the habits that existed before. They're just going in. They're more subject to the algorithm than they are to like scheduled programming with writers' rooms and like teams of writers coming up with formulating opinions and jokes and different things that people could parrot. Millennials are more of like they'll watch documentaries, they'll watch shows on Netflix, and they'll watch things like there might be a streamer or something that they watch, or there might be a podcast that they listen to, and that's more of what they form their opinions off of. But even then, there's enough access to other media that they aren't solely stuck doing that. So, like, I listen to more conservative people like podcasts, and I also listen to left leaning and socialist podcasts because I want a more nuanced perspective on any opinion that I might have with things. There might be good ideas from both sides of the political spectrum for certain situations. But yeah, I think that's all I'm going to talk about today. I think I've talked for a little bit too long. So I hope y'all have a good day. Goodbye.